What would you do if someone came up to you and asked you if you were someone else? Naturally, you would think that that person had just mistaken you for whomever they thought you were. But what if that wasn't good enough for them? What if they came back with another person, and they too were entirely certain that you were this other person? And what if then, after still insisting that you were you, these people bring along copies of the fingerprints of the person they are absolutely sure you are? And what if those fingerprints match yours? This is the bizarre case of Lawrence Joseph Bader. Lawrence Joseph Bader was born December 2, 1926, in Akron, Ohio, to a middle-class family, which his father supported through his career as a dentist. Lawrence spent 2 years in the Navy, beginning shortly after his 18th birthday, and upon his return to civilian life, enrolled in the University of Akron, with the intention of following in his dad's footsteps. However, Bader's performance in school was poor enough that he effectively flunked out of college after a single semester. His time at the University of Akron wasn't all bad, however, as it was the place he met Mary Lou Knapp, the woman whom he would marry on April 19, 1952. Seeking to provide for his wife and their 3 children, Bader took a job as a cookware salesman at the Akron branch of the Reynolds Metals Corporation, for a time the 3rd largest aluminum company in the world. Larry Bader's life was, by all accounts, normal and unremarkable. He was a family man. He was a husband and a father who Monday through Friday would go to work, come home, spend the evening with his family, sleep, and repeat. He had a few hobbies he partook in during his free time, but I'll get to that in a bit. On the morning of May 15, 1957, Bader told his wife that he would be spending the day in Cleveland on business, and that when he was done, he was going to go fishing. Mary Lou, then pregnant with their 4th child, remarked that Larry should come straight home when his business was concluded, not an odd request from a pregnant wife who would be at home with 3 young children. To this, Lawrence gave an odd reply. "Maybe I will, and maybe I will not." After finishing up his business in Cleveland, Lawrence Joseph Bader cashed a check for $400 and used it to pay bills, one of which was an amendment on his life insurance policy. By late afternoon, he was headed to Eddie's Boathouse, a boat rental service off of the Rocky River, which meets Lake Erie. There, he met employee Lawrence Cotler, who warned Bader about an impending storm, which Bader apparently didn't care about at all. Bader rented a small motorboat with attached oars and requested lights for it. Cotler pointed out that it was only late afternoon and that it wouldn't be getting dark for quite some time. Despite this, Bader insisted on the lights. After paying a $15 deposit on the boat, Bader left Eddie's Boathouse on the Rocky River with, as Cotler would later note when talking to investigators, a suitcase. At some point while Bader was out on the water, the Coast Guard happened upon him, and they echoed Cotler's warnings about the storm, advising Bader to get to shore before it came through, but again, Bader declined to heed the warnings and stayed on the water. Those members of the Coast Guard were almost certainly amongst the very last people to speak to a man named Lawrence Joseph Bader. The following morning, the boat that Bader rented was found washed up on Perkins Beach in Lakewood, more than 6 miles from Eddie's Boathouse. The boat was damaged and missing an oar, but investigators found no indication that the boat had capsized, and noted that both life jackets were still securely in their places on the boat. The Coast Guard searched the waters and surrounding areas for over 2 months to no avail. Without a life jacket, they said, it would have been impossible for Bader to survive the combination of the storm and the already dangerous current of the river. After those 2 months, all hope was effectively lost that Bader, or his body, would ever be found. At least not in Ohio. 3 to 5 days later, depending on who is telling the story, a man who introduced himself as John Fritz Johnson arrived at Ross's Steakhouse, now known as the Round Table Bar, a bar and restaurant in Omaha, Nebraska, looking for a job as a bartender. The man had with him a suitcase, as well as a Navy-issued ID. John Johnson claimed that he was traveling the country after having been discharged from a 14-year tenure in the Navy due to back problems, and that he would be a good hire due to his previous experience working the bars at various clubs. Bar owner Mike Chiodo hired Johnson, where he worked for some time while living out of the nearby Farnham Hotel. Over time, Johnson would reveal more details of his apparent past. He claimed to be one of 22 babies left on the doorstep of an orphanage in Boston, where he was raised. When some people asked, he attributed his nickname Fritz to having reminded people of a character from the popular 1920s and 1930s comic strip Katzenjammer Kids. When others asked, he claimed he got it while serving in the military when he got a haircut that made him look like a German soldier. Others still got different stories. The name John Johnson was rarely used, neither by the man himself nor anyone talking about or to him. He went almost exclusively by the name Fritz, signing checks by it, having his bills written out to it. And people loved him. The somewhat eccentric Fritz Johnson was an all-around popular man, making many friends and regularly going on dates with the women of Omaha, shuttling them around in a renovated hearse, which was outfitted with pillows, an incense burner, and a coffee bar. Fellow bar employee Betty Augustine described Fritz as, quote, fascinating, debonair, well-dressed, and not broke. Fritz would continue to make waves throughout Omaha by sitting atop a flagpole for 30 days in an effort to raise money for polio, coming down only once after 15 days before climbing it again for the second half of his mission. After finishing his shifts at Ross's, he would go to the local KBON radio station and perfect his broadcasting voice and use their recorder. After some time, KBON hired him as a radio announcer, which would eventually lead to his job at KETV, a local television station. Despite having a professed hatred for the news, Fritz reported it, for some time hosting a segment entitled Good News of the Day, and eventually becoming the station's sports director. After spending time with numerous women in and around Omaha, Fritz met former model Nancy Zimmer sometime around 1961, and the two would eventually marry, with Fritz adopting Zimmer's daughter from a previous marriage and after 2 years welcoming a son of their own. Fritz spent the next several years as something of a local celebrity, a sociable, admired man who loved being out and about in the city he called home. In 1964, a malignant tumor was discovered, the treatment of which resulted in the loss of Fritz's right eye. From that point forward, Fritz wore an eye patch, which only added to the mystique of the charismatic TV host. Fritz did have a notable hobby: archery. He was talented with a bow and arrow, participating in numerous regional tournaments and eventually working part-time and becoming something of an ambassador for a Nebraska archery firm. In 1965, this archery firm would send Fritz to a sports show in Chicago's McCormick Place to run a booth showing off and selling their archery equipment. It was at this show that Fritz's exciting life would come to an abrupt halt. While making his way through the sports show, checking out different booths, a man from Akron, Ohio came upon Fritz Johnson. Only he didn't know the man as Fritz Johnson. To this sports enthusiast, he was looking at a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to the man who nearly 8 years prior had vanished during a fishing trip, leaving his wife to raise their 4 children alone. The man approached Fritz, asking him, "Aren't you Larry Bader from Akron?" Fritz laughed, assuring the man he'd never been to Akron in his life. The man called back home, arranging for Lawrence Bader's niece, Suzanne Pica, to come to Chicago to see the man for herself. Upon her arrival, she too was certain that she was looking at her uncle. "Aren't you my Uncle Larry?" she asked on February 2nd, 1965. Again, Fritz denied having any idea who these people were, claiming he'd never heard of this Larry Bader. The following day, two of Lawrence Bader's brothers flew into Chicago. When they arrived at the sports convention, they were sure they were looking at their long-lost brother Larry. Unsurprisingly, Fritz, again, claimed he had no idea what these people were talking about. So the brothers decided to find out once and for all. "Will you get fingerprinted?" they asked him. And Fritz replied without hesitation that he would, whatever it took to make these people realize that he wasn't Lawrence Joseph Bader of Akron, Ohio, but John Fritz Johnson of Omaha, Nebraska. Chicago police forwarded Fritz's fingerprints to the FBI, who compared them with the Navy's records of Lawrence Bader's, and Fritz was shocked to learn that they were a match. Fritz claimed to have no recollection whatsoever of ever having been in Akron, Ohio. He claimed to have no idea who Mary Lou or any of her 4 children were. To him, he was John Johnson, a boy who grew up in an orphanage in Boston. This man who was the son of a dentist? He was a stranger. But it didn't matter what he remembered or didn't remember. The revelation that Lawrence Bader was indeed alive kicked off a number of issues. For one, Mary Lou Bader had been receiving life insurance payments, nearly $40,000 in total by the time Fritz was discovered, that then needed to be paid back. And speaking of Mary Lou, Bader being alive meant that he was still married to the Akron woman, rendering his marriage to Nancy Zimmer null and void. Mary Lou, having grieved for years over her presumed dead husband, had been dating and had recently accepted a marriage proposal that was now inadmissible, as in the eyes of the Catholic Church, her marriage to Bader was still valid. Despite her claims that she would stand by her husband, Zimmer would eventually leave Fritz. The man with 2 lives would later find himself working back in a bar, making $100 a week, with $50 going to Mary Lou for child support and $20 going to Nancy for the same. Mary Lou wanted her husband back, and Fritz eventually agreed to a meeting in Chicago, where he regarded Mary Lou and her children as complete strangers. Fritz was examined by a number of different psychologists, all of whom agreed that his bewilderment was genuine. Fritz Johnson truly didn't know who Lawrence Bader, or anyone from his apparent past life, was. Talking to a reporter, he said, "My God, do you not understand? Suddenly I learned that 30 years of my life have never happened. You see, I really have 30 years of memories as Fritz Johnson. What should I do with those 30 years? Throw them out the door?" So what happened? Was this a case of a man who was involved in an accident that wiped the proverbial slate clean? Or was this nothing more than a hoax? There are arguments to be made for both conclusions. While Larry Bader was a well-liked man, he was not without his issues, as is the case with everybody. At the time of his disappearance, Bader was in considerable debt and facing troubles with the IRS for not having paid taxes for a number of years. There has always been speculation that Bader saw his problems piling up, packed the suitcase that Lawrence Cutler spotted at Eddie's boathouse, got into a motorboat when he knew there was going to be a storm, and faked his own death. His parting words to his wife Mary Lou on that fateful day come to mind. When asked if he would come straight home from work, he replied, "Maybe I will, and maybe I will not." Add to this the fact that mere days before he went missing, Bader added a clause to his life insurance policy, one for accidental death. The mounting debt, the packed suitcase, the curious timing of the life insurance amendment, and the indifference towards the multiple warnings of the impending storm are all pieces of a puzzle that suggest that this man committed fraud. On the other hand, the life of Fritz Johnson was not one evident of someone trying to keep a low profile. He made his presence known around Omaha, regularly appearing on the radio and on television, which isn't something someone trying to stay hidden would do. I mentioned earlier that Larry Bader had a few hobbies. The most substantial of these, by far, was archery. Bader had participated in a number of tournaments in and around Akron, tournaments that, once he would come to learn of his own passion for the bow and arrow, Fritz would happily participate in. Fritz had no hesitation when it came to venturing into the same circle that Larry Bader had once found himself, the very thing that brought his true identity to light. As I mentioned, medical professionals deemed Fritz's, or Bader's, amnesia to be genuine. He made no attempt to hide himself from his previous life because to him, there was no previous life to hide from. They also speculated that the cancerous tumor behind Fritz's right eye could be to blame for the case of self-mistaken identity. Another such explanation is that of dissociative amnesia, a very rare but very real medical condition in which the afflicted person, incredibly overwhelmed by stress or trauma, enters an almost fugue state, getting the urge to travel and crafting a new identity while losing all of their previous memories, replacing them with new ones from the new persona. In these rare cases, pieces of the former life can break through, and this could certainly prove to be true with Fritz. His passion for archery returned to him, as did the disdain for the news that Larry Bader exhibited. Furthermore, the name Fritz itself was something of a relic from his past life. Larry Bader, in his time spent as a cookware salesman, worked for a manager named Mr. Zeft. Mr. Fritz Zeft. As likely as it is that he obtained his nickname from a decades-old comic strip, it's equally, if not more likely, that a memory buried deep in the amnesic Bader's mind came to the surface. But we will never know. The cancer that caused Fritz Johnson to lose his right eye would return the year after the man recognized him at the sports convention, only this time, it was in his liver, and only this time, it took his life. The man known as both Lawrence Bader and Fritz Johnson died on September 16, 1966. Friends and loved ones in Omaha had a memorial for John Fritz Johnson, and the following day his body was transported back to Akron, where he was buried on a family plot in Holy Cross Cemetery. Along with the true answers as to what happened. What do you think happened? Do you think Lawrence Joseph Bader saw an opportunity to leave his life and debts behind? Or do you think he was simply the victim of some medical condition that launched him into being the focus of a mystery still talked about half a century later? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time.